Okay. And then button. The down button, the one that's worn out. Hey, I can see it. Okay. We only have 5 lessons. As I was outlining all of this, there was a lot more material than 5, so I had to pick. We could do this again in a year and there'd be a totally different set of 5, right? But I tried to pick the 5 that I thought were most significant to telling the story of Moses. That's subjective, so please don't hold me to that. And hopefully by the time we're done Sunday evening, we'll be on the same page about that. As has been mentioned, just last fall, I traveled with the Appian Media team to Egypt. We were shooting a new production on the life of Moses and the Exodus event itself. And so we tried to follow one of the proposed routes of the Exodus. It was the most exhausting international trip I have ever taken, full of all kinds of adversity and trials and no sleep and all kinds of stuff. I'll probably be sharing some stuff on that tomorrow morning with some of the kids that we'll be getting together with. But some of the images that you're going to see this week, that trip. So like that picture, my camera from the top of one of the proposed Mount Sinai's. That was the sunrise from the top of Mount Sinai. I'll try to point some of those things out as we go. And one of the things that stood out through the course of that trip was just trying to put ourselves in Moses' shoes. What was it like for Moses to live in the world that he lived in, to experience what he experienced, and then wind up at Mount Nebo? What was that like for him? And what would that have been like for the Israelites? You know, there's so much of the story of Israel that we're super familiar with, but they hadn't lived it yet. I mean, one of the very first lessons you learn in Bible class as a kid is the story of Moses. And you make a little reed basket out of an upside-down walnut shell and put a little baby Moses in there, right? Like, we know the story from childhood, but they didn't. And so to try to go back and see it with fresh eyes, as if you hadn't experienced it yet, and I'll try to do that to the best of my ability this evening. I chuckled with Adam's introduction. You know, there are some guys that can dispense a lot of information. And I was waiting for him to say, but that's not Jeremy. We'll see. We'll see how we do. So, moving forward, our first lesson is to talk about the deliverer's birth, right? We want to talk about the birth of Moses. And that's really easy to do. You can go to Exodus and you can start reading through chapters 1 and 2 and get the information that's there. And we're going to do that, and we're going to look at it in smaller paragraphs. But before we do, I think it's important to try to establish some kind of historical context for the birth of Moses. I mean, if you were to ask your average person on the street about the Exodus and the life of Moses, they could probably spit out some high-level details. They could probably spit out that the Israelites had spent time in the land of Egypt, and over a period of time, several hundred years, became subservient to the Pharaoh, and he was oppressing them, and they needed a deliverer, and Moses was born and spared from death, and Pharaoh's daughter found him in the Nile and raised him up. Like, most people can spit out those high-level details. I remember in high school when they came out with the Prince of Egypt, the cartoon, right? That's how old I am. I was in high school when that came out. Had hair then too. Most people get it. Like, that's in our culture. But there's more to it that I want us to think through. What you're looking at it's an aerial satellite image of Egypt, and then superimposed over the top of it, it's not my map, I'm borrowing it. Otherwise, it'd be a little bit more legible. During the life of Moses, especially the birth, preceding his birth, Egypt was actually split into 2 different ruling families. And this sounds counterintuitive, but the northern Egypt area was called Lower Egypt, and the lower part of Egypt was called Upper Egypt. Have fun with that. But the native Egyptians, the Egyptian dynasties that had lived there for centuries and centuries and centuries, they were in charge of Upper Egypt, the southern part of the Nile. And there was great pride to trace your family back to, we are original native Egyptians. And that's still there today. Like when we were there last fall, and I rode on a boat on the Nile River near Cairo, and the guy that was the captain of our boat had been doing it for generations. Like he did it, his father did it, his grandfather did it, and if you ask him, hey, where are you from? He'll tell you, I'm originally from. He makes a big deal out of that. Okay. Leading up to Moses' birth, there was another group of people in Lower Egypt that were not from Egypt. They were actually from what we would end up calling Canaan, and they were called the Hyksos rulers, Hyksos. And there's been a lot of debate over who those rulers were, and I'm not going to get into all the minutia of that. But when you look at a chronology, if you look at that chronology, going back to about 1800 BCE on the bottom, and then it tops out at about 1200 BCE at the top. And as you work from your outer right in, it talks about the kingdoms themselves, the dynasties, the rulers of those dynasties. And what you see on the side is the West Semitic settlement of the Delta on the very bottom. So from about 1800 to mid-1500s, you had people coming from the land of Canaan and settling in there, and you had these rulers come in and capture northern Egypt. They weren't native to Egypt. And so their pottery looked different, and their houses looked different. Their culture looked different, but they wanted to be considered pharaohs. And then toward the time that Moses is born, the southern Egyptians are trying to recapture their land and drive those people out. They're trying to drive the Hyksos rulers out. And so what you see just before 1500 BCE is you see the expulsion of the Hyksos, where the Egyptians have gotten rid of them, right? When you start placing the biblical chronology on top of that, on the bottom, at around 1876, Jacob enters Egypt. You've got the end of Genesis happening and taking place. Right? And you remember Jacob's family is seen favorably because of what Joseph has done for them in preserving the kingdom. And so they're given a favorable location. So up in Lower Egypt, northern Egypt, up by the Nile Delta in some of those blue areas, and of Goshen that's given over to Joseph's family for them to live in. They bring their herds, they bring their flocks, and they settle in there. And by the time you get to Exodus, it says there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Well, it's possible that you've either got a Hyksos ruler who's about to be expelled, or you've got a Pharaoh that has finally consolidated the whole thing from southern Egypt. Is familiar with the Joseph story. And what you end up getting is in about 1526, that these Hyksos rulers are getting kicked out and defeated. And when you look at 80 years later, because Moses at about 40 years old tries to deliver the people, gets rejected, goes into Midian. He lives a shepherd's life for 40 years. At 80 years old, he comes back. He's sent back by God. And so years later, you're looking at about 1446, the Exodus takes place. And about 40 years after that, the conquest of Canaan begins. And then what you get in the historic record is you get these two phrases used in Egyptian manuscripts. The Shashu and the Apiru appear in Canaan, and Apiru is a word that references the Hebrew, Apiru Hebrew. And it's one of the Egyptian references to the Israelites, and making mention of them being in the Canaan area, right? So there's so many more details. There's so many rabbit trails we could chase from all of this. All we need to know relating to the birth of Moses, and the focus of the lesson tonight is, when you think about the political climate, you need to think about a divided Egypt, northern rulers that are not native, but they be seen as pharaohs. They want to be seen as deity, right? And then we'll talk about, a little bit later, we'll talk about the relationship between those Hyksos rulers and the Israelites and their relationship to them. We'll focus on that tomorrow. So hope that sets the stage. We're not going to do this every lesson. But this is the historical context that Moses was born. I didn't hear that in my 5-year-old Bible class. Even if I had, I wouldn't have remembered it. All right? So maybe what is more familiar to us is this. I wish she had more, but people only have the capacity that they have. But one of the graphics that she created was this timeline of the story of the Exodus and Moses' life. And so what you're looking at there, on the very, very bottom, you have those time periods. You've got the 1446, the birth of Moses. You've got the 1406 date of entering into the land. You've got the chronology of the biblical books on top. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua. In the middle, in the green, you've got the locations that these events take place. So they're in Egypt. They travel out of Egypt. They go to Mount Sinai. In the middle, they wander in the wilderness. And then they wind up in the plains of Moab. But then at the death of Moses and entering into the land, you have them at Mount Nebo about to go into the Jordan Rift Valley. And then you have periods, time periods on the bottom in blue. You have 400 years. You've got the 2 months. You've got 11 months at Mount Sinai. You've got 38 years and 4 months wandering. You've got about 7 months in the plains of Moab before they go in. It's just a helpful little visual to help you put the pieces together. Okay, because we read, unless you're taking notes, lose track of time and location. And so that's really helpful. We might refer to that later. Now, with all of that as background, study the Exodus. And why talk about Moses? I think there's several answers to that question, but there's one in particular that I want to answer by telling you a brief story. So, about halfway through our trip last fall, we rushed, like I thought my heart was going to explode. We rushed to the top of Jebel Musa, one of the traditional Mount Sinai locations. And there's a whole story about why we had to rush. We were trying to get up to the top in time to catch the sunset from the top. And then we were going to spend the night. And then we were going to capture the sunrise the next morning. And then we were going to head down. And so we rushed up to the top. Crazy change of elevation. It's a couple of hours. And we got to the top. We got the sunset. Like, there was so much drama. I'm summarizing hours of drama. We got there. And we shot what we needed to shoot. So I'm sitting on a rock looking at the sunset being beautiful. Me, not the sunset. You laugh at that. And when the cameras turned off, we came back down from the very top, which was about, 50 yards. And 50 yards down, there's this little, several shacks where you can buy trinkets and something to eat or drink. And that's where we were going to sleep. So there are people that are coming up there all hours of the day and night, like it never closes. And there was a guy in one of the shacks, pretty tall guy, looking. He was raised Orthodox Jew, but now he's an agnostic. Believes in the possibility of God, but doesn't believe in God. He's not an atheist, he's an agnostic. And that blew my mind. I'm like, why on earth would you explode your heart to hike to the top of Mount Sinai if you don't even believe that God exists? Makes no sense to me. And he started explaining. And I think this answers the question. Why study the Exodus? Why the life of Moses? And he said, whether I believe in God or not, the Exodus event and the life of Moses carry so much meaning to every culture all across the world, and it holds some significance, so I wanted to experience that. He needs to push that a little bit harder, because it only has significance if it happened. Otherwise, it's just a great story. And so we had a really long conversation, and he kind of started following us all over the place. We were up there, continuing to talk with us. And so while I was doing my shooting, my brother-in-law was evangelizing. But the story, the events of the Exodus and the story of the life of Moses are tremendously significant. The Exodus is the story of the people. That's the point that we go to. A little time until you'll see where I'm going with this. The Exodus event is the story of the Bible. The Exodus event is your story of Christian. So that's reason enough. Okay? So now that I've teased that, let's look at the text. Open your Bible to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus 1. And we'll just look at the opening paragraph, really the introduction to get us into the content of the book. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So it's just catching you up. It's really summarized the last several chapters of Genesis. God, through providence and planning, used Joseph and his life to provide life for others. Really, you've got Jesus and Joseph from Genesis, but that's a whole nother point. Is he's trying to explain why are the family of Abraham in Egypt? Why are they there? And verses 1 through 7 give you a summary of why they are there. Okay. Now, when you get to verse 8, it starts to give you a little historical context as to what's going on leading into the Exodus. Verse 8, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Hyksos, chronology and some of the timing, I believe it was one of the most successful lower Egypt, upper Egypt, southern Egypt, native rulers who was finally taking charge of the whole thing and had expelled the Hyksos. And it says he didn't know Joseph. So he had kicked out these Semitic kings. They had expelled these Semitic kings, but there were still Semitic people there. And so he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. What are we going to do with these guys? They're scared to death that they're going to rebel and attempt to overthrow. And so verse 11, therefore they set taskmasters over them. And all likelihood, those are also Jewish people. Some of them are Jewish people. Some of them are Egyptian. Moses is going to attack one of them a little bit later. But historically, some of them were native. Some of them were from among the Hebrews. They set these taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. As a kid, I always pictured like slave labor. That's not what this is. The ancient kings would conscript citizens to spend a part of their year working on massive building projects. It was a form of taxation. Actually, Solomon practiced it. So when you get to Solomon and all of his incredible building projects, he conscripts his citizens to do a lot of the labor. And if you remember, that actually sets up for the people rioting against Rehoboam later. Where Rehoboam, hey, you think life was hard under my dad? I'm going to make it worse. And so there's a cultural thing where you have the king who is forcing his people to work for the country. And that's what's going on here. They built for Pharaoh, in verse 11, store cities, Pithom and Ramses. And we could throw a map up there and show some of that. We might do that a little bit later. Verse 12, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So let's catch up. In verses 1 through 7, we're introduced to the Israelites, even though they're not Israelites yet. They're just the family of Abraham. They're the family of Joseph. They're the family of Jacob. In verses 8 through 12, you have the oppression of the Pharaoh, where he's making life harder for them and he's targeting them specifically. Starting in verse 13, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So they're making life more and more burdensome. That word burden is used multiple times through the passage. As you keep going, you get into the story of the midwives. They actually make things even worse. The Pharaoh decides, hey, this isn't enough. Oppressing them isn't enough because they're multiplying like rabbits. They just more and more and more of these Hebrews are showing up and they're spreading around. What am I going to do? And so he practices a very archaic form of birth control and says, we're going to start killing the boys. Let the girls live, we'll kill the boys. So if you kill off the boys, there are less boys to make more babies, but also you're killing off the manpower, the ones that might be more likely to take up arms. You're getting rid of those people out of the population. And so what he says is to the midwives of the Hebrews, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah in verse 15. When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a son, you shall kill him. If it's a daughter, she shall live. And the midwives have to make a decision. In verse 17, we're told that they feared God. And out of their fear, their awe, their reverence for God, they don't do what the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the male children live. Now, it's talking about those two women. It's not saying all the midwives all over the country. It's saying those two women, that's how they handled it. So in verse 18, the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, what have you done? Why have you done this? And let the male children live. And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwife gets there. You know, they call for the midwife, but they're so strong, and they pop out. In verse 20, God is favorable toward them. God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. They continue to multiply despite Pharaoh's efforts. Verse 21, because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. So verse 22, Pharaoh pivots. Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Forget trying to kill them. Like what he was trying to do was covert. He's telling the midwives, show up and go through the birth process, but kill them really early in the birth process. No big deal. You just have a bunch of stillbirths going on. What he's doing here is, we're done with that. As soon as you realize there's a male baby among the Hebrews, pitch him into the river. And that's just so horrible to say. So what you have in verses 13 through 22 is death of the boys. And then you get to the birth of Moses. But before you talk about Moses, you have to talk about his parents, right? Verse 1, now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. Now, we know later, a little bit later in the text, there's an older sister. We also know there's a brother, Aaron, later. But Moses is the one that falls under this edict. And verse 2 says something interesting. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. She sees something in Moses. She's like, I cannot throw this boy into the water. Just can't do it. Like, I would struggle throwing anything in the water. Anything. I would struggle throwing any child in the water. She sees something about Moses. And that's echoed in Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews chapter 11, Moses' parents are mentioned. Let's turn over there really quick. Put a marker in Exodus 2 and turn over to Hebrews 11. So much of Hebrews 11 is dedicated to Moses. Look at verse 23. Hebrews 11:23. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Like, this has nothing to do with Moses. It has nothing to do with decision-making ability because he has none. He's not actively engaging his will. He's just a little cute ball of chub. But his parents are making a decision. And his parents have the same fear for the Lord that the midwives had. They're putting themselves at risk. They're putting their other children at risk. They go ahead and preserve his life. And what it says is they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, a little bit later, we're going to talk about how Hebrews talks about how Moses was not afraid of the king. Let's talk about that for just a second. They were afraid of the king. This isn't saying that there was absolutely zero. Like if you were doing a percentage from 0 to 100%, they had zero fear of the king. They had zero fear of the Pharaoh's edict. That is just not true. What it's saying is they did not let their fear of the king drive their decision. So like over in 1 Peter, when Peter tells Christians, don't fear anything that's frightening. Well, that's a paradox. How do you not fear anything that's frightening? He's already said it's frightening. He's acknowledging that you're scared, but he's saying, don't let that fearful thing rule your decision making. I think you've got the same thing going on here. Moses' parents, even though they knew the risks, even though that scared them, they chose their fear of the Lord and let that drive their decision making. And so when you come back to Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 and 3, really what you're looking at is you're looking at the faith of Moses' parents. Because in verse 3 of Exodus 2, when his mother saw that she could not hide him any longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch, and she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river. Technically, if someone said, hey, did you put your kid in the river? Yes, I did. I'm just not going to tell you that he's in a boat that's floating right over there. But I threw him in the Nile. He's in the same river that all the other boys went into. Not only that, when you get to verse 4, his sister, Miriam, is watching over. Verse 4, his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. I don't know if she was instructed or not. I don't know of a passage that informs us of that. If you find it, let me know. I don't know. But she's there watching. And in verse 5, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. And she took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. She knew who he was. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, she pops up, hey there, should I go and get a wet nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? You need some help with that crying baby? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother, without telling her it was the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." You know, I never paid Anna for nursing any of our children, ever. Didn't do that. She just did it because it was the best thing for our kids that we thought at the time, and she was able to, and so she did. I never paid her wages for that. It's just kind of the way being a mom works. Like, if you got paid for everything that you're worth getting paid for, no one could afford you. But God provides for Moses, and he provides for the family, and he provides an opportunity for this mother to continue mothering Moses. So later on, what we're going to look at tomorrow is that Moses, as an adult, knows who he is. He knows who his people are. He knows that he belongs to them. How does he have that knowledge? Partly because of the mother that was influencing him along the way, but also because the Pharaoh's daughter knew who he was. Verse 10, when the child grew, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. At some point, there's an official adoption process that takes place. He's all yours. And she named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." And in that little text, verses 1 through 10 of chapter 2, you have the Exodus story in the life of one baby. You have a Hebrew child that faced death and was delivered through water. That's Exodus 1 through 14. All day long. His birth typified the exodus of the Israelites. So to summarize that section, what you've got is the provision of God. You look at Moses' life, you have an introduction to the situation, you have the oppression of the leader explained, you have the death of the boys trying to reduce the population, you have the faith of the parents, and you have the provision of God. And we're going to make some points in just a minute, some application points, some principles that we can take from that. But there's something else we need to do first. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 18, Deuteronomy is a collection of sermons that Moses preached to the Israelites just before he died, just before they went into Canaan. And in Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15, he explains, "The Lord God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen." And that is repeated a couple of verses later in Deuteronomy 18. Moses, just as he died, tells the Israelites in a prophetic manner, at some point in the future, God's going to bring you a second Moses. And he's going to be like me in several ways. And when you experience and meet that second Moses, listen to him. A little bit later in the text, he goes into more detail. God is going to give him words that he wants you to hear. Listen to him. So is it any wonder that we need to talk about Jesus? So when you look at that timeline, which is just so long, you look at that timeline and you get about partway through, about halfway through in that red section, there's a little red cross underneath it. You have the birth of Jesus. And every single point that we just made about the birth of Moses, you can make about the birth of Jesus. When you go to Matthew chapter 1, you have an introduction. And what Matthew does is he introduces all of these generations, 3 sets of generations that lead to the birth of Jesus and the prophecy is birth. And he goes through and he's making this big, especially messianic connection. Jesus is the promised king. He's tying him to David and his lineage. And then you get to Matthew chapter 2. Let's look at Matthew chapter 2. And the first few verses there. Matthew does a very similar thing to Moses 1. He sets up somewhat of a context, a historical context. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east to Jesus. The readers of Matthew knew who that Herod was. They knew the Herods and the mess of the Herodian family. They knew about Herod the Great. And it was shortly after this, Herod the Great died. And the year of his death, which is how we're able to know that it happened right around this time prior to him dying. So within about 12 months, between 40 and Herod was a crazy man. He was vindictive. He was violent. And he was oppressive. If you go through and you read the Gospels, they give you some insight into that. They talk about the building projects of Herod. They talk about the power that fell on some of Israel's construction. Like, he was not a good man. And it was during his reign that Jesus was born. You keep reading in Matthew chapter 2. Verse 2, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." And that's what the wise men are asking. Where is the one who was born king? And this King Herod, all of a sudden, in his purity, in his jealousy, in his rage, in his violence, he's threatened by the birth of a baby. So verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Like, the whole town knows what could potentially happen here. They know that a crazy ruler is threatened, and they're scared what he's going to do. So in verse 4, assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. He's trying to locate him. They told him in verse 5, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. Skip down to verse 7. Herod summoned the wise men secretly. The star had appeared. And he said to Bethlehem, "Oh, search diligently for the child. And when you found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." Not being truthful at all. But it sounds good on paper. Verse 9, after listening to the king, they went on their way. Behold, the star that they had seen, when it rose, went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Now, they go back a different way in verse 12. They were warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, so they take off. Right? We talked about the oppression, because we're a similar sequence to what we see on the other side of the chart. But before the oppression, you actually have the birth of Jesus. And when you think about the birth of Jesus, put together some of the Gospels, Luke chapter 1, Matthew chapter 1, and Luke chapter 2. You think about the angel going to his mother, Mary, and explaining to her that she's about to give birth to a child. She's going to conceive a child by supernatural means and give birth to him. That's over in Luke 1. And she asks a question about that and then ends up in faith saying, "Let it be as my Lord says." Like, this is the way it's going to go. And then Joseph, after she is evidently pregnant, is wrestling with, what do I do? I've got a pregnant wife and it wasn't me. And he chooses, after being instructed by an angel, he chooses to go ahead and marry her and adopt Jesus as his own. What all of those texts together is you see the faith of the parents of Jesus. There's a lot about Jesus they don't know. There's a lot about Jesus they don't understand. I love all of the passages in the New Testament that describe Mary treasuring things in her heart, where she's like, "Oh, this is significant, not quite sure how yet, but I'm just going to hang on to it." I love those passages, right? Very similar to Moses' parents, you see the faith of Jesus' parents. When you go to Israel, trying to catch up. When you go to Israel and you go to Bethlehem, there is a building built on the top of the traditional location of the birth of Jesus. And so when you walk through this little tiny stone door, and you look down this room, incredible pillars. You walk across this kind of interesting floor, which is actually an extra floor. The more original floor is underneath. You walk past all of that, and you go to the front, and there are several religious groups that worship in there now. And behind that sanctuary, and beneath that sanctuary, there's a cave. In that cave, be a stone manger, and it's where they used to hold animals. Most of us, when we think about the birth of Jesus, we think about a red barn, like our typical American red barn, and we think about a wooden trough that we use for feeding and watering horses. That's not what they had. A lot of the people in Bethlehem used caves, both for living in and for taking care of their animals. And so, more likely than not, Jesus was born in a cave and laid in a stone manger on the inside. Now later, in Matthew chapter 2, picking up with where we left off, looking at verses 13 through 15, when the wise men had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt. And remaining there until the death of Herod, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." So Jesus and his family leave. They leave everything behind, and they go to a foreign country in order to keep him safe. Again, you see the faith of his parents and what they're willing to do to preserve his life. But even in Matthew chapter 2, you see Jesus being connected to the Exodus. He's connected to Egypt. He's going to be called out of Egypt. And we're still not done. Continuing in the next few verses, chapter 2, verses 16 through 18. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under. Like for good measure. I'm not sure how long this kid has been alive, so I'm just going to kill them all. According to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. And in that church of the Nativity, it's the name of the church in Bethlehem, in the cave underneath the sanctuary, is the cave of the innocents, where in that sanctuary they found in these nooks the bone boxes of infant male children, which a lot of archaeologists believe relate to what Herod is doing here. And do you see all the parallels between the birth of Moses and the birth of Jesus? This jealous, angry, vindictive ruler, the one who's scared and threatened, and the oppression that's going on, and the faith that the parents have to practice, the death of his peers. But you also see the provision of the Lord. You see the provision of the Lord. Because God spares Moses from death, and God spares Jesus from death. He prepares in his providence, he prepares a place for them to be safe and to grow up into adulthood to fulfill the role that he has for them. That doesn't mean that their life is a bed of roses. It doesn't mean it's easy. But God is working behind the scenes. And there's so many lessons that we could talk about. But let's just make a couple. The first is this, that every deliverer God raised up in some way pointed to our ultimate deliverer, Jesus. Some more than others. Joseph clearly does. Moses clearly does. Like by the time we're done this weekend, you're going to see Jesus all through the life of Moses. Okay? And that's on purpose. God designed it that way. Right? thing is this: God is providentially working through history to accomplish his redemptive plan, and he plays the long game. He knew what the Israelites were going to need. He knew what Moses was going to need. He knew they needed to be in Egypt. He got them down there hundreds of years before they even needed Moses to be born. And he's preparing a way to do that through the life of Joseph. And you're looking at Joseph's life and you're like, wow, that life is kind of a hot mess. But God is working in that to provide for all of these things. And just another thing to think about with Moses, we're introduced to Joshua really early in the story of the Exodus. He's preparing for Moses' replacement before anyone knew Moses would need a replacement. As far as Moses knows, when he goes back to Egypt, he's like, man, this is going to be a short ride up to Canaan, and I'm going to walk him into the promised land. He doesn't know what all is going to happen yet, but God did. And he was providing a replacement leader before they even knew they needed one. Listen, God is working through history for you. Don't ask me all the ins and outs of that, because it's his providence. And usually it's easier to spot in hindsight than looking forward, but I am confident that he is, because he does. I just don't know how. But by faith, I trust that that's the case. There have been too many instances in my life where I have met the significance of meeting them until much later. There's just no way. I'll give you an example. This is just on the fly, right? Visiting with the Poes tonight at dinner. She was asking about our kids. She was verifying, okay, how many kids? And we were talking about the two boys that passed away, Cooper and Whitaker. Do you know that moving down to Birmingham was providential? It was providential. Our younger special needs son passed away in March 2013 in Indianapolis. Cooper was still doing all right then. And he had all of his doctors, he had all of his professionals, he had all of his therapists, all of them, like we had our network. And they had known him most of his life. And we had done tests and done so many other things. Moving to Birmingham meant we got a reset. All new doctors, all new professionals, all new therapists. And it wasn't until we got to Birmingham that we got some answers that we never had in Indianapolis. Now, I'm not doctors in Indianapolis. They're amazing. There's more of history, and it's a fresh set of eyes and ears. And we didn't know that was going to happen until we came. Right? I don't know what God is working in the course of your life, but I'm confident he's working in the course of your life. And since he plays the long game, you need to be patient and trust him. Okay. This may seem super obvious, but it just needs to be said. The life of a child is precious to God and should be to us as well. When you go back and you look at what those parents risked in order to preserve the lives of their children, and what those midwives risked in order to preserve the life of the families they were serving, the life of every child is precious. And I do not care what the circumstances of their conception were. God doesn't care. Their value is not determined by the circumstances of their conception. They're created in his image and have value to him regardless. So we need to preserve life. And building on that, we want to follow the examples of those parents, and we want to live by faith, no matter the personal cost. It's going to cost us something. But let's parent that we ought to parent because it's what God has called us to do. And even when we don't understand why, I'm going to parent the way God wants me to parent. Right? And there's so many other things we could say. But I want to end with this. And we may be ending with this point every single lesson. As we look to Jesus, the one who was like Moses, what we're instructed to do is listen to him. Jesus is the second Moses. And since he is, we're supposed to listen to him. Be thinking about how you can listen to him and respond to him tonight. All right? I'm so excited to get through these next several lessons. It's going to go quick. It's just a couple of days, right? 48, 72 more hours. It's not long. If there's any way that you need to respond to our incredible, glorious, amazing God. I love the songs that we sang before the lesson. Our holy God. Come to the front and let us know while we stand and sing.